I welcome you to this event. I'm so glad that you're here. I realize it's not morning for all of you, but whatever time of day it is for you, we're glad that you're here. This event is being sponsored by the Unitarian Universalist Association Office at the United Nations, the Burma Task Force, and the NGO Committee on Human Rights. And we're going to be talking about Islamophobia and the intersectional framework of Islamophobia and race. Islamophobia is not associated to one particular region. It happens all over the world. And we have speakers from many different parts of the world, including Myanmar, Sudan, Tibet, and the United States. This conversation will reflect and uphold the international expectations of the UN Declaration and all forms against all forms of intolerance based on religion or belief. We want to try to break down stereotypes and myths. This panel serves to break these down. We are very grateful for the chance to listen to these stories and experiences of people fighting Islamophobic sentiment perpetuated by hate and prejudice on behalf of governments and civil society actors. That being said, we want to mention that people practicing Islam also predict crimes, and one terrible one just took place in France. But we urge you to keep in mind that one bad actor or even a group of bad actors does not represent all the people of that particular religion or group. We urge you to continue learning about this topic. This is a big issue, and we're just going to begin to touch the surface of what this is all about. So we will be sending you some materials after this is over to make sure that you have some resources to continue your education and learning on the topic. We want you to look at what we send you, but also do your own research. And with that, let me basically say that we have several people that have helped us with this event. Adam Carroll from the Burma Task Force, Scott Stearman from the Baptist World Alliance, Allison Hess, who works in our office. We have 4 wonderful interns, Ashley, Nurjahan, Shanice, and Lena. And so we thank them all. They've all done a great deal of work to help us out. And with that, I want to turn it over to my very dear friend, Reverend Scott Stearman, who represents the Baptist World Alliance at the UN. He has many other titles that he can go to if he wants to. But for the moment, he's a very good friend and very knowledgeable on these issues, and we thank him very much for being here. He'll lay out the background for this topic.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you, Bruce. I do always appreciate our friendship and your leadership in these contexts. I am a Baptist, as Bruce just said. I am an ordained minister. I serve a congregation in New York City, as well as represent the Baptist global body, as well as the national body around these circles at the UN in advocacy work around human rights and religious liberty. Baptists are the largest Protestant group, and are like Islam. They're a very diverse religious group. So I am in 3 minutes going to address the purpose of this particular gathering, and in one word, of course, the purpose is to eradicate Islamophobia. We recognize that might not happen with this one meeting, but we do have speakers who we believe are going to address this issue we're trying to get our minds and hearts around very, very beautifully. And we hope at the end to come up with a kind of an action plan that will continue to sow seeds of understanding and sow seeds of hope to end what is really a scourge for so many human beings around the world, and really for the entire human race. So the way I want to do that in less than 3 minutes is by one story and one name. The story is from 2005. I was then, and for about 12 years, living in St. Louis, serving a large Baptist congregation there. And in November of 2005, there was a big gathering of statewide Southern Baptists. And at this meeting of thousands of people, the leader of the Southern Baptist Convention, which was a large, in fact, the largest Protestant denomination at that point in the United States, and in this statewide meeting with thousands of people, the leader of the Missouri Baptist Convention said, and I quote, "The Muslims have a sword at your throat, and they are commanding you to convert or die." Now, even in the wake of a few years before 9/11, this kind of rhetoric and hateful rhetoric has no place anywhere, but certainly no place in a group of people that claim to be people of compassion and love. And I was incensed, as was many other people. Of course, it was irresponsible rhetoric and hateful. I wrote an op-ed for what was then in the esteemed paper back in when people actually read newspapers, the Post-Dispatch, in which I said in the headline, "Moderates should conspire to take over America." And I described how my denomination had been hijacked by fundamentalists in an analogous way that Islam is sometimes hijacked by fundamentalists. And I said, our goal really should be, as right-thinking people, to get people together so that we can lead towards understanding. Now, as a result of that, I got a great deal of hate mail and hateful calls and so forth from some people, but I also received a beautiful note from a young Pakistani woman who wrote for another paper, who grew up around Baptists. She says, "I was so surprised to hear about this hate speech." Well, this issue, this ugly issue of hate towards Islam, is a global one that I think is based on two fundamental realities. One is ideology. Put it this way, there's so many people who just have no understanding, awareness of what Islam actually teaches at its core. One is ideological. The other is race. The fact is that in the world, and certainly in the United States, where white supremacy reigns and seems to be ascendant, we live in a world where most adherents, the majority of adherents of Islam, are people with brown or dark skin. And this reality is at the base also of a sort of emotional fear and hatred of the other. And we're going to address that some today. Now, I will close by mentioning a name that I think gets at another aspect of what we're trying to get our minds around today. And the name is Timothy McVeigh. I would be curious if we had time just to know who knows that name. Timothy McVeigh was the largest domestic terrorist in the United States until 9/11. Timothy McVeigh was responsible for killing 169 Oklahomans. I'm originally from that state. Three of those 169 were friends of mine who died in this bomb that was set in front of a federal building in Oklahoma City. 169 people died in this bombing. Now, was Timothy McVeigh, here's the question, was he a Christian? If you ask a lot of white Christians that very question, they're going to say, of course not. Of course not. Were the 9/11 terrorists, were they Islamic or were they Muslim? Of course they were. Well, that gets to the heart of, I think, our issue in another way. We seem to let ourselves off the hook when it's our group, and yet stare down at others who we believe are other and different, and that leads to a kind of fear that's very aligned with hatred. So our goal, to advance understanding and education and encourage us all towards positive actions to rid the world of this scourge. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Scott. Is from Sudan. And she doesn't know this, we haven't met yet, but I actually served as a U.S. diplomat in Sudan, and I'd like to tell a story or two before we introduce her. I was posted to Sudan in 1997, and my first day in the country, I went to the chief of protocol. It was Ambassador Said Saad, and just the day before, the United States had imposed comprehensive economic sanctions on the entire country. So Ambassador Said Saad started arguing with me, and he started saying, this is the wrong thing to do, and the American government shouldn't be doing this, and it's not going to produce the results that you want. And he's just kind of haranguing me. And then he took a big breath and he said, okay, welcome to Sudan. If there's anything I can do for you, please let me know. And that was really the template for my entire time in Sudan. There was another time I got off a plane. I was coming back to Sudan from Nairobi, and he happened to be at the airport, and he saw me and he said, welcome home. Welcome home to Sudan, he said. And even though our diplomatic relations were about as tense and as difficult as they could be, our personal relationships were very warm and loving with each other, and I'll never forget that. So with that said, our next speaker is, and I'm going to mess up your name, so please forgive me, Mariam. Say your last name for me, please.
Abdalgadir.
Abdalgadir. Okay, I can say that. I know that name. Okay, I just don't recognize the spelling. Abdalgadir. Okay, Mariam is a Sudanese community organizer and artist living in the Bay Area. I'm assuming that's San Francisco Bay. She is passionate about providing care and support to the Black community, specifically Black Muslims. Most recently, she has been doing work collecting community aid for a Sudan Children's Martyr Family Fund, and is now in the process of helping a Sudanese family navigate immigration. Terrible, that's difficult work. I've done that too, so kudos for that. As she seeks out safety from political violence. Please welcome Mariam.
Hi everybody. Thank you, Bruce, for the introduction. It's nice to meet you, and it's nice to know that you had a lovely time in Sudan. You're welcome anytime to come back. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Hello everybody, good morning. I hope you're having a good day so far. It's 7:32 over here, so I've been up pretty early. Kind of had to like pinch my face to like wake up this morning. I'm not used to waking up this early. But I'm so happy to be here. Thank you all for having me, and thank you to the Unitarian Universalist Association at the UN for putting this talk together and inviting me to speak on this panel about my community and my experience. As Bruce said, my name is Mariam Abdalgadir. I'm a Black Muslim artist and community organizer living here in the Bay Area. I just wanted to make sure, can everybody hear me? Sometimes I have speaking problems on Zoom, so nobody really, okay, good. So as I said, I'm really happy to be here. And I believe that in today's political climate, it seems more than necessary that we intervene on the issues of the Black community through its intersections. So I'm more than happy to speak with you today about the Black Muslim experience and provide insights and answer questions to the best of my ability. I would also like to thank my African American Muslim community elders. I reached out to them before this talk for their blessing and their wisdom and their advice. So I believe that it's crucial when talking about systemic racism at any scale that we include the African American perspectives. They're the ones who fought for the very civil liberties that the Muslim community urges to be upheld. They are also the most common victims of wrongful imprisonment, racial profiling, and FBI police collaborations. So I think that the least and most important thing we can do as Muslims is recognize that they exist and do our best to diminish bias and anti-Blackness towards them and all other Black people within Muslim spaces. So African American Muslims and Black Muslims in the US suffer from anti-Blackness in the Muslim community, ranging from non-Black Muslims not returning greetings, salam, which is an essential part of our religion, to not considering Black Muslims worthy enough of marrying their children, as well as just general alienation from mosques and Muslim spaces because of their Black identity and proximity to Arabness and Arab speakers. This experience can also be extended to non-Arab, non-Black Muslims who experience the same thing within Muslim spaces when they are not primarily Arab speakers or have a primarily Arab identity. So after speaking with Elder Amila Amin, I learned a lot about the African American Muslim experience and African American Muslim history here in the United States. So my elder Amila Amin is a board member at Lighthouse Mosque in Oakland, and the co-founder of Murid, which is an incredible nonprofit organization that advocates for impoverished folks and elderly. And right now they're working on this really amazing project where they have basically this big truck that they'll be driving around to provide halal hot meals for those in need. So like many, Sister Amila comes from a long generation of African American Muslims in the United States. Most people don't know that a big percentage of slaves brought to the Americas in the transatlantic slave trade were practicing Muslims, and many passed down the religion through the next generation. And as a result, Black Muslims account for 1/5 of all Americans. Oftentimes, it's assumed that by non-Black people and non-Black Muslims and African Muslims that African American Muslims are mostly convert. This is false, and it overarchingly supports the anti-Black notion within Muslim spaces that Black Muslims lack religiosity and knowledge of Islam and are generally ignorant in Islamic matters. The Black Muslim community in America is very diverse and has people with different cultural backgrounds and worldviews, including myself. As Bruce said, I come from Sudan, Africa. Sudan is a Black country that was colonized by both the British and the Ottoman Empire. As a result, there is a big Arab-speaking Muslim population within Sudan. And Sudan was Arabized in the 1970s when it joined the Arab League. So the various cultures and ethnic groups within Sudan, which are so vast and many, there's so many different types of cultures and languages within Sudan, were all forced under an umbrella Arab Muslim identity that most either fit under or were alienated and oppressed as a result of. So it's important to recognize that Sudan is a Black country with a multi-ethnic identity and has various religious groups and people, and is not necessarily dictated by Arabness and Islam. So this whole history kind of complicated the Sudanese identity within the world, and as a result, we are racially profiled and identified as Black and inferior throughout the Arab region, but profiled by the West as a Arab terrorist state. Hence, the United States has put Sudan under a state-sponsored terrorist list because of our previous regime. And as Bruce had said, I guess he was in the early phases of the beginning part of the sanctioning that happened in Sudan over the last 30 years. So this sanction greatly affected the growth of our economy and hindered the aid to our most vulnerable Black populations. And thankfully, through the tireless efforts of my community members, it was announced on Monday that Sudan will be lifted from the state-sponsored terrorist list. And this was a big win for the new transitional government, which has made great strides in distancing itself from the policies of the old regime, as well as including new reforms that will progress Sudan's society as a whole. And there is a consensus in Sudan that the old regime has misused religion as a tool to oppress and make Sudan a safe haven for extremists. So delisting Sudan from the terrorist list will not only propel the transitionary government's effort, but also significantly change the lives of those who have been marginalized by the old regime. And so I'm just gonna kind of talk about Muslim identity and kind of terrorist identities. And so over the years, Muslim activists have pushed back on terrorist identities and labelings brought forth by the West by pointing out that it directly affects the quality of life of our brothers and sisters in the global South, first and foremost. And we can see this example highlighted through the sanctionings that happened in Sudan. But these same activists are oftentimes quiet about the injustices and happenings of Black Muslim countries like Sudan. This specifically was the case last year during Sudan's mass revolution and bloody massacre, where many Muslim activists fell silent and did not support our cause. So it is imperative as Muslims to recognize that this is a global struggle and that we are all affected. And what we have in common as Black Muslims is that we face the same racial violence and struggle under systemic oppression across the world. And so we must continue to fight for one another, whether it's here in the United States or in Africa. Our struggles are binded and our freedom is implicated in peace, justice, and freedom for the other. And so I would like to talk about police brutality here in the United States. Many victims of police brutality and senseless murders at the hands of white supremacy have been Black Muslims here. Jacob Blake, Nia Wilson, Yasin Mohammed, Ahmaud Arbery, Stephon Clark, Shukri Ali Said are just a few names of a list of Black Muslims who are no longer with us. In these instances, Black families grieving are often shamed by the global community and Muslim community to show compassion for their aggressors. They're often told to turn the other cheek and forgive. And there's often no room for Black rage or being upset or even grief. Black people never try to really seek vengeance in situations, and all they really do want is justice. And people constantly expect us to take hits as a community and just turn the other cheek. We need others, we need you, non-Black Muslims and non-Black people, to say enough is enough. And it is time that you stand up for Black Muslim brothers and sisters and demand that actions be taken. In Islam, we learn that the followers of the Prophet are called al-Ansar. And so what did it mean to be Ansar al-Sunnah? It meant to sacrifice what is hard and do what is right, even if it means going against your own soul. You can give someone something, but it may not be an inconvenience to you. That is not advocacy. Al-Ansar would give people the last of their food and their money and the best of their clothes. Sacrifice their comfort and happiness to serve others. Shying away from speaking up about injustice towards the Black community hurts us. The most powerful thing you can do is tell your child, I was wrong, what can I do to compensate you? You don't get to choose how you support us. You ask and you listen, and to have true sincerity in wanting to do the right thing. We have to start thinking about anti-racism and not just not being racist. It's okay, these things happen. Sister Amila told me that we need to start being comfortable with being uncomfortable. Striving if we fall short and commit to doing better, standing up and recommitting once again. We are put in this world to treat each other well. Let us all strive to do so. Alhamdulillah. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Let me just add a little point, since I love studying history, and many of the Africans who were enslaved and brought to America were Muslims. And there's a story of a man, and I cannot remember his name. Maybe somebody can correct me or add this, but he was actually an Islamic scholar, and he was actually en route to finding paper that he needed for his scholarship. He was looking for paper so he could write stuff down. And on this journey to get a supply of paper, he was kidnapped and enslaved and brought to America. So Islam has a very long history here in the United States. A lot of African Americans who were enslaved in America tried their best to practice their Islamic religion as best they could over generations against great persecution. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to our intern, Ashley Amuka, whose parents come from another part of Africa. Maybe she can give a little introduction of that, and she'll ask Mariam some questions. Thank you so much, Mariam.
Hi, everybody. Good morning. My name is Ashley, and I'm an intern here at the UUA office. And my parents come from Nigeria, so it's the west coast of Africa. And a third of Nigerians are Hausa Muslims, and so I'm really familiar with Islamic spaces as well. Me and Mariam go way back. We've been friends for a couple of years now. We went to the same undergrad, so when this came up, I knew she was the right person, and her message was amazing. And so my question for you, Mariam, is that we talk so much about the struggle of, you know, Black people in America, Black people in diaspora, and we talk so much about how we feel defeated, how we feel vulnerable. But I think my question for you is, in your community, what does being your authentic self look like? Like, what are some of the joys associated with being, you know, a Black Muslim, or being Black and being Muslim, that you kind of combine to make, you know, a joyful experience, a joyful existence?
Hi, Ashley. Nice to see you. Hope you're having a good morning. That's a great question. I think for me, personally, being a Black Muslim, too, in my sincerest form, means advocating for my community and setting an example for younger generations, whether that means, you know, having hard conversations with elders about Blackness, just accepting who I am as a person, as a Muslim, not shying away from my Muslim identity and my religiosity, accepting who I am in certain spaces where other people don't look like me, and embracing that, and, you know, saying my name is Mariam Abdalgadir and not saying Mariam Abdalgadir, you know, just setting an example for the people who are younger than me in my community, because oftentimes I am a leader within my youth group. And so for me to be my authentic self, it's really important for me to also show others that this is possible. It's okay. Like, we live in America. You don't have to Americanize yourself to be Muslim and to be accepted as a Black person. So for me, just being a Sudanese Black Muslim, it just means living out my authentic self through embracing my culture, my language, my identity, and advocating for people who look like me, who are not necessarily accepted by the government and the rest of the world.
Yeah. That's super important, to keep that resilience and keep that, you know, those coping mechanisms up, especially as you go through racism and Islamophobia and what that looks like together. And my next just very brief question is, what do you need the rest of us to do for you to show up as your best self?
As I said earlier, it's not really about people not being racist, or, you know, just like kind of silencing themselves as well, or shying away from these important conversations. I think it's important for people to sit and listen and ask and be curious. And, you know, we all have bias within us. These things happen, especially in the world that we live in with the media and everything that we have been exposed to. It's very, very much like something that Black people are like expecting from others, because we've dealt with it our whole life. But the one thing that we do deserve is respect, and we also deserve your ear, and we also deserve a lending hand and some reassurance and understanding of our experience and where we're coming from. So I think for people to just be open and accepting and embracing of Black people, regardless of whatever biases they may have, I think that's a major takeaway that I would like people to have.
Thank you so much, Mariam. It was really good to see you. I'll talk to you later. Love you.
Too.
Thank you so much, Mariam and Ashley. Let me. And our next speaker is Tenzin Mortalaro, and I hope I didn't mess that name up too badly. We have a special presentation from him. He's a student at SUNY New Paltz, majoring in international relations with a focus on Asian studies and is a Buddhist practitioner. He is a scholar and teacher of the Tibetan Buddhist tradition and has worked for many years on the preservation of Tibetan culture and its tradition of nonviolence. His work in advocacy and social change, he is awarded a Triple C award by New York State in 2018, and in the same year participated in the National Student Leadership Conference on International Diplomacy in Washington, D.C. Oh my goodness, not another diplomat, just like me. We'll have to have a talk about that. Now I have to find you. Where did you go, Tenzin? Because I do want to spotlight you. There you are. Welcome, the floor is yours.
Hi, thank you, Bruce, for the introduction. So, samalo atishtaleshu. Hello, everyone. So today I'm going to be talking briefly about the situation in Tibet by offering some background to the topic and highlighting some of the key parallels between the situation in Tibet with the situation in the Chinese province of Xinjiang. So Xinjiang is a territory of the People's Republic of China in northwest China. It's directly north of Tibet. And it's been a region that's been talked about a lot in the news this past year in light of the suspected Chinese re-education camps where nearly 2 million Uyghur Muslims are now being held. By doing this, I hope to reveal that there is a very clear pattern by the Chinese Communist government of a systematic poor treatment of its ethnic minorities and religious minorities, particularly in its westernmost territories. So I believe that to tackle Islamophobia and persecution of Muslims in China, it's necessary to understand the struggles of other ethnic minorities in China and their fights for freedom. So I also believe that the Tibetan and the Uyghur communities have a lot in common in their struggle for freedoms, and that those communities abroad must work together to end the persecution of Tibetans and Uyghur Muslims. I don't know if, I can't see the presentation. Are the slides up? Hello?
No, they're not. Who has your slides? Do you have them?
No, they were sent to you, Bruce, via email.
Oh, well, yeah. Unfortunately, I don't have them. I'm sorry.
Okay. Yeah, that's all right. I'll just keep going.
All right.
I don't know. I do have it up. There is an option for me to share my screen if you want me to try that.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, sure. Just take 1 second. Okay, it doesn't seem to be working, so I'm just gonna keep talking then. So Tibet is a region southwest of mainland China. It's often referred to as the roof of the world and is believed to be the inspiration for the famed Himalayan utopia Shangri-La. Tibet is best known for its extensive practice of Vajrayana Buddhism and as home of the Dalai Lama. So Tibet was invaded by the People's Liberation Army in 1950 under the direction of Mao Zedong and the Chinese Communist Party. However, prior to 1950, Tibet had its own functioning government. It still has a national flag, and it minted currency and issued internationally recognized passports. Despite all of this, however, China has for a long time claimed that Tibet, as well as Xinjiang, have always been a region of China. Despite these claims, there really are there is no factual basis for these claims. Aside from these more obvious examples of the historic independence and autonomy, oh, okay, great. If you want to go to the fourth slide, that would be great. That'd be great. So aside from these more obvious examples of the historical independence and autonomy from China, Tibet also has a unique Himalayan culture that is very distinct from Han Chinese culture. The most obvious difference being the dominating Buddhist influence, which permeates nearly every aspect of Tibetan life and culture. Clear differences can also be seen in the traditional dress of Tibet, called chuba, as well as their artwork and architecture. This is also the case in Xinjiang, where the practice of Islam is very prevalent and the culture is radically distinct. Tibetans and Uyghurs alike believe that their culture, religion, and way of life are being systematically destroyed by the Chinese government since the Cultural Revolution, continuing to this day, and there are many obvious overlaps between Tibet and Xinjiang regarding the repression of religion and culture. Next slide, please. So in 1950, the Chinese Communist Party decided that Tibet must be brought under Chinese rule. On October 6, 1950, the People's Liberation Army invaded the Tibetan region of Chamdo, where nearly 180 Tibetans were killed. Over the next few months, the PLA invaded nearly every region of Tibet, including the capital Lhasa. Next slide, please. 9 years of resistance to Chinese occupation by the Tibetan people came to a head in March of 1959, when Tibetans were beginning to fear for the life of their leader, the Dalai Lama, who is known to the Tibetan people to be the reincarnation of Chenre Zig, a living Buddha of compassion. On March 10, 1959, Tibetans rose up when hundreds of thousands of Tibetan men and women surrounded the famous Potala Palace in Lhasa, calling for a free Tibet and for the long life of the Dalai Lama. The protesters were met with brutal military force, which resulted in a massacre of Tibetans and eventually forced the Dalai Lama to flee to India, where he still lives today. Thousands of Tibetan refugees followed him into exile, and the situation in Tibet got exponentially worse. Next slide, please. So after the failed uprising, the Chinese government used it as an excuse to exercise brutal military enforcement of CCP ideals seen throughout Tibet and other regions of China, including Xinjiang during the Cultural Revolution. This included the forced closure and destruction of monasteries, the killing of monks and nuns, and the total repression of Tibetan culture. In fact, for nearly a quarter of a century, Tibet was completely closed off from the rest of the world, as Tibet entered a period that many Tibetans, including the Dalai Lama himself, have described as hell on earth. Next slide, please. So during this period, Buddhist monasteries were bombed, often at night when monks were sleeping. Tibetan children were given guns by PLA soldiers and forced to shoot their parents. Buddhist relics and religious sites were burned and destroyed, and monks and nuns were made to violate their vows of celibacy by being forced to fornicate in the streets. These bouts of humiliation and torture at the hands of the Chinese were known as tamzi, or struggle sessions. And I personally have heard many firsthand stories from our Tibetan elders who have survived the Chinese invasion and the Cultural Revolution, including from some of my own Buddhist teachers who have told me much of the horrors of living in Chinese prisons. Next slide, please. So China's interests in Tibet have always been strategic and economic, the same as in Xinjiang. China uses these territories for its immense mineral wealth and natural resources. Tibet is known to many ecologists as the water tower of Asia, since its high elevation and massive amounts of fresh water is the source of 9 of the largest rivers in Asia, sustaining nearly 2 billion people. China has spent vast amounts of time and money to build dams at many of Tibet's major rivers. The CCP uses the power they have to turn off the tap to influence the political decisions of other countries, especially in regards to Asian countries' support of China's ethnic minorities, both Uyghurs and Tibetans. The disruption of Tibet's water sources have also caused major flooding throughout various regions of Tibet, causing further physical and economic hardships on the Tibetan people. Tibet is also rich in copper and gold, which China uses to fuel its economic and industrial expansion. Its traditionally pristine environment is increasingly under threat as environmental exploitation increases every year. Likewise, in Xinjiang, nearly 35 million tons of crude oil are expected to be extracted by the end of 2020 alone, and the region also contains China's largest coal and natural gas reserves, an estimated 40% of the national total. Next slide, please. So Tibet is roughly the size of Western Europe and is almost 1/3 of what we now consider to be the People's Republic of China. Because it is such a vast region that contains a relatively small population, China has used the plateau to move millions of Han Chinese migrants over the past 7 decades, making Tibetans a minority in many parts of their own country. Similarly, in Xinjiang, Han Chinese migrants have been flooding into the region intensely since the 1980s, and northern Xinjiang was populated by over 2 million Han Chinese just between 1957 and 1967. Just as China uses March 10th uprising of 1959 to justify the policy of cultural and religious oppression in Tibet, the CCP also uses the handful of cases of terrorism and violence committed by Muslims in Xinjiang to justify the mass surveillance of the region and the internment of nearly 2 million Uyghurs. Although throughout the years, the freedom and treatment of the Tibetan and Uyghur people has fluctuated slightly as leadership in Beijing changes, the legacy of the Cultural Revolution continues to this day, both in Tibet and Xinjiang, as China is one of the world's greatest human rights abusers. Next slide, please. So in both regions, public displays of religious belief are highly regulated and frowned upon by the CCP. With 98% of the Tibetan population identifying as Buddhist and the vast majority of Uyghurs being Muslim, the policies of the CCP towards religion affect nearly everyone. In Tibet, over 6,000 Buddhist monasteries have been destroyed, pictures of the Tibetan spiritual leader, the Dalai Lama, are banned, and religious gatherings are often flooded with unnecessary amounts of military and police force. Tibetans were also recently told by the Communist Party leaders that government subsidies would only be made available to families who replaced images of the Buddha and other Buddhist icons with communist leaders, such as the current Chinese President Xi Jinping and Chairman Mao. Similarly, the CCP announced in 2019 that it would start working on a revised version of the Quran, which would better reflect the ideals of the Communist Party. Next slide, please. So both Tibet and Xinjiang are supposedly autonomous regions of China, and the CCP claims that they have a great deal of freedom and self-governance. However, the freedom and democracy within these regions are often criticized by foreign governments and human rights watch groups, including the United Nations, Amnesty International, and Freedom House. In fact, every year, the independent watchdog organization Freedom House analyzes global challenges to freedom and democracy and rates countries and regions from most free to least free. Consistently, Freedom House ranks China as one of the worst human rights abusers and Tibet as being one of the least free regions in the world. This year, 2020, Freedom House ranked Tibet as being the second least free region in the world due to the oppressive policies of the CCP towards the Tibetan people and their track record with human rights and government representation. In fact, since the establishment of the so-called Tibetan Autonomous Region in the 1960s, no ethnic Tibetan has ever held its top political position. Next slide, please. So the current party secretary of Xinjiang, Chen Quanguo, was also the party secretary of the Tibetan Autonomous Region from 2011 until he assumed his position in Xinjiang in 2016. During his time in office, he extensively increased the surveillance of Tibetans, as well as divided urban regions into grids and placing military and police outposts throughout the region so as to better monitor and control the activities of the Tibetan people. In fact, between 2012 and 2017, China's domestic security budget doubled, while in Tibet and Xinjiang, it more than tripled. Similarly, arrests of ethnic minorities both in Xinjiang and Tibet largely take place covertly at night, with little to no information being given to those being arrested, their families, or their communities. It is also common for entire families to disappear without any notice or warning. Next slide, please. So it is increasingly clear that the same thing is now happening to the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, as nearly every Uyghur home now has its own security cameras placed in front of the homes, and often specific military or police officials assigned to Uyghur families. Chen Quanguo, the current party secretary of the region, is also largely responsible for setting up the extensive systems of re-education camps in Xinjiang, similar to those seen in Tibet, where brainwashing and physical as well as psychological abuse is common. So given the parallels between the situation in Tibet and the situation in Xinjiang, it's very clear that the Chinese government has exhibited a clear pattern of cultural assimilation, religious oppression, and overall poor treatment of its ethnic minorities. Next slide, please. So despite the overwhelming hardships faced by ethnic minorities in China, both Tibetan Buddhists and Uyghur Muslims, The resistance hasn't stopped, and Tibetans and Uyghurs alike remain courageous and strong in their struggle for freedom, even in the face of the might of China and the threat of the total destruction of their cultures and way of life. So, Tujina, Bogilo, thank you.
Thank
Hi.
you very much. We have Lena.
Hi, everyone. Thank you. Thank you, Tenzin, for this presentation. It's very, I think now that we know, we have more information on the parallels between Xinjiang and Tibet, we can focus on how to bring these groups together so they can fight for social injustice. So you are a student activist, and I think it's important, even as an average everyday citizen, a student, you're very vocal, you're very present, you travel, you make speeches. So what are ways that the people that are attending this meeting, this panel, can advocate for injustices like Islamophobia on the global stage?
Yeah, so I would say for me personally, as a Tibetan Buddhist and somebody within the Tibetan community, I always try to carry with me the spirit of Tibet and the words of the Dalai Lama. So I think, when talking about Islamophobia and the situation in Tibet, that taking any chance that you can get to educate people, and not only to educate people, but to listen to people, listen to the different perspectives, listen to the victims of human rights abuses, the victims of Islamophobia. And you don't have to go far. You don't have to travel to Tibet or Xinjiang to see the effects of Islamophobia. They're right here in our universities. So I think really keeping your eyes and ears open and, educating people on what you do know, and connecting with different groups like Tibetans and Uyghurs. I think that for genuine autonomy for the Tibetan people and freedom for the Uyghurs, I think that can only come about by linking the different parallels between the plight of the Tibetans, the Uyghurs, Hong Kongers, the people in Macau and Inner Mongolia. So I think educating people and listening is paramount to fighting Islamophobia.
Yeah, thank you so much. So also I was wondering, you and Mariam also brought up the importance of elders within your community in bringing wisdom and helping guide social justice and fighting against Islamophobia. So can you speak on the importance, or like one of the most important things you've learned from elders within your community in fighting Islamophobia and social injustice throughout the world?
Yeah, so I would say that the Tibetan elders within the Tibetan community are highly respected, and many of the lamas and Tibetan teachers are also Tibetan elders. I would say the biggest takeaway that I have gotten from the Tibetan elders is their resilience. The Tibetan youth is angry. They're angry that, we're entering the now 6th generation of Tibetans being forced to live in exile. Tibetans are not being born in their homeland. But when I see the Tibetan elders, they have a kind of resilience that is different. They have a resilience that is, it's not angry, it is courageous and it's strong, but at the same time it's compassionate. They feel for the Chinese people who are also living under the systematic oppression, and they feel for other minority groups such as Muslims facing Islamophobia in various countries. There's one story that I'll tell. There was a monk who had escaped from Tibet. He had been imprisoned in a Chinese re-education camp for some years after the Cultural Revolution. And like many Tibetans, he ended up escaping Tibet and fleeing over the Himalayas to India. And he went to see His Holiness the Dalai Lama as he takes audiences with newly arrived Tibetans. And when he met the monk, he asked him if he faced any danger, and the monk said, "Oh yes, yeah, I faced the greatest danger while I was in prison." And His Holiness asked him, he said, "Oh, what kind of danger?" He was thinking danger for his life, a danger for his family. And he said, "I faced the greatest danger of losing compassion for the Chinese people. I faced the greatest danger of losing compassion for my captors." So I think the biggest thing that the Tibetan elders have given to the Tibetan youth and to myself is this strong stance of nonviolence and compassion for the Chinese people.
All right, thank you so very much. And my apologies for not having your PowerPoint up when I should have, but really fantastic presentation. We will have a Q&A after all the speakers have finished. We have one more speaker. And I do want to tell people, please put your questions in the chat box and I'll try to monitor it. One question I'll ask you to hold, Tenzin, is about, is there any possibility of Tibetan Uyghur solidarity? But I will hold that until the end. So thank you so much. And our next speaker, for once, I don't think I'm going to have troubles pronouncing her name, Mariam Osman. And she is currently an MSW student candidate at New York University, resides in Brooklyn. She has a passion for mental health advocacy and social justice. It rose during her undergraduate years at Southern Connecticut State University. She intends to be a licensed clinical social worker and provide therapy services and educational programs on mental health to underserved populations. Please welcome Mariam Osman.
Ooh. Hello, everybody. Salam. Good morning, afternoon, evening. I want to thank everybody for taking the time out their day to attend this event. And also I want to give a special thanks to everybody who had anything behind the scenes, from the panel to my fellow panelists to just the interns, just everybody. I just want to give thanks. So as introduced, I am Ghanaian and Nigerian. Getting specific with it, tribe-wise, I'm Yoruba, and then I am Hausa, which happens to be the largest ethnic group of the Sub-Sahara, which is like in West Africa. Sorry. So as I was generating an outline of what to present with you guys, I was brainstorming with a couple of my friends and family members. During our conversation, there's this one question that was brought up to me, and from there, that's how I kind of created my whole entire presentation for you guys. So the question was, how would you identify yourself? It seems like a simple question, right? But I mean, within the past 8 weeks of my first semester of graduate school at Silver School of Social Work, I was always bound to do a class activity or participate in a class discussion in which I had to answer this question. So at this time, to put a little joke out there, if I had $1 for every time within the past 8 weeks I was asked, how would you identify yourself? I would be having some good amount of money right now. So some of my peers would go on to say things such as dog mom, dog dad, hobbies that they partake in. However, I, like other students who belonged in marginalized groups, were quick to identify the identities of us that made us marginalized. Without a doubt, every time I would always say that I'm an African-American Muslim woman. And a fun fact that, like, we discussed in our classes is that when people are usually asked that question, people are more likely to say the parts of them that are pretty visible or like viewed within like a magnifying lens. So I like to call myself a triple threat because of the fact that I am African American, a woman, and a Muslim. So that's 3 strikes in the America that we live in. So with the fact that I was able to say that I was openly Muslim, this would, however, has not been the case with my life. And I'm just gonna give like a little backstory. So like with the earlier years in my life, I was born and partially raised in the Bronx. And with like my earlier years of education, whenever I'd bring up the fact that I was Muslim, not to have a Mean Girls reference, I know I'm sounding very pop culture right now, but I would often get comments such as, how can you be Black and Muslim? So with comments like these, I began to have the feeling that I had to choose between my racial background or my religion, like how many Black Muslims have to endure. Although I was going through all this, I was fortunate enough to have a safe space with the mosque that I attended during my years of living in the Bronx, which is Yankasa Masjid. Was right next to my grandmother's apartment. Would always go there every weekend for Islamic studies and such. And even though all this was going on, it was nice to see people who looked like me, like fellow Black Muslims, congregating. So I felt like a sense of security. However, this sense of security did not last for long. I ended up moving to a suburb in Connecticut called Hamden. It's right next to New Haven, about 15, 20 minutes from Yale. And my dynamic and my sense of belonging instantly changed. So the new mosque that I ended up going to, so it was predominantly Arab, and my family was for the longest until like recently, were probably like the only Black Muslims there. So I faced a lot of unpleasant interactions with non-Black Muslims, such as like discriminatory comments, such as always feeling that like my faith was being tested to see if I was Muslim enough due to my racial background. I've actually been called the slur abid, which is slave in Arabic, and they wouldn't know that like I knew what they were saying, and I would call them out, and they would always try to switch it up to, oh, but we're all slaves to Allah, but it's such a negative connotation to it. So with all of this happening, and then also facing discrimination in school with my with all parts of my identity, there was a time in my life where I would have opted out to talk about my religious beliefs, because already in the social climate that we do live in this country, I was already being discriminated against due to my racial background, and I felt like adding my religious faith, would be more of a burden. However, when I started my undergraduate year, undergrad, that's when I had the pleasure of going to a school that was branded as a social justice institution, who celebrated all different types of people, regardless of your background, who always emphasize advocacy, self-advocacy, and advocacies of others. And being involved, protesting about things that I cared about, that caused me to want to be more authentic with my identity and such. And actually last year, I had the privilege of attending Hajj. So for those who aren't Muslim, who aren't familiar with it, Hajj is the privilege, is the pilgrimage that all Muslims who are able to do physically and financially able to do so must take, where they have to go to Mecca and Medina and perform a series of tasks. And this has to be done at least once within your lifetime. Now, during my trip to Hajj, I was in bliss. Like, it was just beautiful seeing all different types of people from all different parts of the world, whether they looked like me or not. It was just beautiful for the fact that, like, for probably the first time in my life, I was within like a Muslim space of people who did not share the same racial background as me, that I wasn't looked at my racial background. We were all focusing on the same thing, and I was worshiping to Allah. So it was very blissful. Now, and I think that's it. My takeaway from all of this is that Black Muslims, we do exist, and we don't have to, and we shouldn't have to always feel like we have to compromise parts of us to be accepted or live a double life, like how I felt like I had to. We can appreciate the racial backgrounds and then also the religious background also. So yeah, thank you. Again, thank you everybody for coming out, allowing me to share my personal story. And yeah.
Thank you so much. And I have some remarks to make at the end of this, but before that, our intern, Nurjahan Akhtar, has a couple of questions for you.
Hello, thank you so much, Mariam, for sharing your experience. I also grew up in the Bronx, and I'm also practicing Muslim because of my family. And it's not easy growing up in the Bronx, I'll say that.
Definitely not.
Definitely not. And I understand like how you're saying of your skin color, it is like a double jeopardy kind of situation. I will share that I go to school with my niece. We shared high school experience in a similar time. While I was in my senior year, she was in her freshman year, and I would go into school with her, and we had metal detectors, and they would always stop her and not me because she actually put on the hijab and she was of darker skin. And we always knew it was her like boots that would ring, and I also like would ring too, but they would always be a little bit more, in a sense, aggressive with that. So thank you for sharing your experience. My question is, what is one thing you wish more people knew about being Muslim? Yeah, about just the religion, the faith, so you could be like, this is why I practice it and why I do what I do.
Ooh, this is a loaded question because like there's so many things that I want to tell people about being Muslim. Like I just have so much pride and happiness to belong in a religion like this. So one thing that because let me think about this. So one thing that I wish that more people knew about Islam, because I do know like some people are very fascinated with the religion but are discouraged due to their racial backgrounds, is that although there is apparent anti-blackness within the community, something that really pushed me through and kept my faith strong was that Islam is not just following the commands of Allah in the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. It's a way of life. It's taught me how to communicate with others, how to carry myself. It has taught me, it has literally built me to be the woman that I have, that I am today. And it's kind of sad that people can't see, people can only see through the surface and through the bad, but won't take the time to do research and see that it's not just a religion, it's a way of life. It promotes peace, unity, equality, and equity.
Thank you. One last thing. What would you say to someone who is interested in learning more about Muslim or just wants to like educate themselves within the religion or anti-Blackness within being Muslim?
So personally, what I would recommend is going into your local mosque and speaking to those who belong in the congregation about it. I know personally, like before I moved out to Brooklyn, at my mosque in Connecticut, we did have some non-Muslims who came in just out of curiosity to gain more knowledge. I've been a witness for a couple of shahadas, which is like the declaration of faith, which is when someone converts into Islam. I've been a witness several times of it, and it's very beautiful watching it. So yeah, feel free to drop into your local mosque. Don't be afraid to ask questions. Personally, me, I tell all my friends, I'm literally an open book. I may not know all the answers. I'm still learning every day, but I'm even open to answering questions about misconceptions they might have, skepticisms, just general questions.
Thank you so much. I'll pass it on to Bruce.
Thank you so much. Really beautiful presentation. I want to end with some thoughts of my own. And to do that, I need to tell you a little bit of my own history. I am a gay man, and I'm married to an African American. And so I see on a daily basis the racism that he has to endure because of the color of his skin. And in 1997, I mentioned earlier that I had been in Sudan. Before that, I'd been in Pakistan and got to know a lot of Sufi Muslims in Pakistan. And when I got to Sudan, I said, are there any Sufi Muslims here in Sudan? And they said, oh, yes, we've got tons of Sufis. How many Sufis do you want? So I actually attached myself to a couple of Sufi orders and asked a lot of questions about Islam. At the end, I had a former minister of higher education and his daughter, and I would sit with them in the evenings and ask all kinds of questions about Islam. And some of my questions were very stupid. And I said things like, well, if I become a Muslim, do I have to hate Jews? And they said, no, you don't have to hate Jews. You don't have to hate anybody. Do I have to hate Christians? I said, no, you don't have to hate anybody. You know, in fact, the young woman that was teaching me, she said, I go to a Catholic school and I have nuns and priests teaching me and I love them and they love me. So I asked all those questions. And one of the reasons I said my Shahada in Sudan, and I actually performed the Hajj with a group of Sudanese Hajis, which you can imagine me with my white face with a group of Sudanese Hajis, but I performed the pilgrimage. And it's a wonderful, inspiring event, and it has all of the world there, and you see everybody of every nationality, just fabulous event. I am not a practicing Muslim at the moment. I'm a practicing Unitarian Universalist. And one of the things that I drifted away from Islam a bit was because they're not very accepting, generally speaking, of gay people like myself. And so I found that a bit off-putting. And I also noticed racism within Islam. And that was one of the things that I liked about Islam, was that they seem to be much less racist than Christians. And I still believe that to be true. But there's racism in Islam, unfortunately, as well. One of the things that I think we're seeing here in the world and here in the United States is a lot of white Christian panic, because both white people and Christians want supremacy. They want Christians, and they feel that if anybody else takes over, if, in other words, if non-white people take over, or if non-Christians take over, they will do unto us what we've done to them. And we know how bad we've been for centuries: slavery and torture and all the things that we've done. And the facts seem to indicate that is not going to happen. If you look at South Africa, for example, which was ruled by a white minority, which did terrible things to the population there, when the black majority took over, they did not go around killing all the white people. In fact, they've integrated white people into the country, and both communities are living peacefully side by side in a very prosperous country. When Islamic countries have been stable and thriving, they generally get along very well and have good relations with Christians and Jews and people of other religions. Not perfect, mind you, and I'm sure you can probably come up with exceptions to the rule, but I would just say to white Christians, as somebody who comes from that tradition, our fear is overblown. And we need to operate less from fear and more from compassion and understanding. And I want to come back to Tenzin. I loved his comment where he said that one of the elders of Tibetan Buddhism was afraid when he was in prison in China that he would lose his merciful feelings towards the Chinese, his compassionate feelings. And it's amazing that people can retain their compassion. And again, I'm married to a black man. He's one of the most compassionate, kindest people I know. And despite the racism that he has to undergo on almost a daily basis, that compassion and kindness remains. Islam also is a religion which teaches compassion. It teaches charity. Again, my teachers told me that they did not want to eat their dinner if they thought their neighbor was hungry. They would first take food to their neighbor and make sure their neighbor had food before they would eat themselves. And so there are many good qualities to this faith that people need to understand and sympathize with. So I do want to come back to Tenzin if I can with this question. Do you think there's a possibility of Uyghur-Tibetan solidarity?
Yeah, actually, I think it's more than a possibility. I think it's an inevitability, and I think it's absolutely necessary. You know, the Uyghurs and the Tibetans, we are all victims of the same oppressor on two levels. On the one level, the Chinese Communist government, and on the other level, the just more general forms of Islamophobia and racism and ethnic persecution. So I think that absolutely that is possible. And I've been to many protests for Free Tibet and March 10th protests, and oftentimes, you know, I'll see Uyghurs, and I've had conversations with them. And at the last March 10th uprising day protest, there were many speakers, including Tibetans, Uyghurs, Hong Kongers, and one of the speakers said something that really moved me, and I have tried to carry this with me. She said that I am Tibetan, I am a Uyghur, I am a Hong Konger, I am an Inner Mongolian, and in that way we have to fight as though that is our mentality, that we are all in this together. And the parallels are overwhelming. They have the same people you know, Chen Huangguo, the party secretary, is the same person in Xinjiang as was in Tibet. So the parallels are nearly identical in so many ways. So I think that support between the Tibetan and Uyghur communities is absolutely necessary, and I think it's more than possible. Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you so much. I'm going to let you have the last word. It's so beautifully stated. May we all be one of whatever faith or wherever we're from. Let us all support each other and be one with one another, and to respect each other's faith and traditions and customs. And unfortunately, we actually have gone over time, but I really want to thank all of our presenters, all of our participants, everybody who showed up, all the wonderful comments in the chat. Thank you all for being here. I hope we get to do this again very soon. And with that, I'm afraid I have to say goodbye. But we will do this again, and then we will, again, thanks. I don't have the right words to express my gratitude to all of you, but thank you so much to all of you for being here. Bye-bye.
Thank you.